The man known to history as Cecil John Rhodes was born on the 5th of July 1853 in the market town of Bishop Stortford in England. His father was the Reverend Francis Rhodes, the small town's curate. He was an older father and was already in his late 40s at the time of Cecil's birth. Biographies of Cecil Rhodes' life uniformly characterize his father as an iron disciplinarian, whose brevity and gloomy nature was the stuff of local legend. He was renowned for delivering concise, staccato sermons from the Anglican pulpit at St. Michael's Church that lasted precisely 10 minutes, not a second more or less. Cecil's mother was Louisa Peacock. She could not have been a greater contrast from her husband. Where he was thin, tall, and somber, she was short and stout, possessing a cheerful and loud voice, and was always the convivial centre of parish life. She was the daughter of a successful Lincolnshire banker, and her brother Anthony was a newly elected Member of Parliament at the time of Cecil's birth. Her marriage to the Reverend Francis Rhodes was certainly one of financial equals. The Rhodes family were wealthy landowners, with interests in construction, dairy farming, and tile-making factories, and by the close of the 19th century, the Rhodes were in receipt of rents from more than 1,600 properties. Cecil was the 6th child born to the Rhodes household, and he would be followed by 5 more. The middle child of a large family, Rhodes was undoubtedly his mother's favourite, and with her encouragement, he began to display willful tendencies from a young age. The Rhodes servant would later recall making a batch of jam and setting it aside to cool. Upon returning to it, she found it had been eaten, and young Cecil was clearly the culprit. "Cecil, did you eat that jam?" she asked him, and he replied, "Yes, I am sorry it is gone. It was very good. Make some more," and he walked away, whistling. However, the young Cecil Rhodes also had a more anguished and bad-tempered side. He was frequently solitary and reserved, sometimes exhibiting distressed behavior, even crooning and rocking himself to and fro. Psychological portraits of the young Cecil seek to define a childhood with a smothering, indulgent mother and an austere, uncommunicative father, leaving the middle child Cecil yearning for a sense of real belonging. But ultimately, Cecil's childhood was exceptionally stable and privileged, in an England that was uprooting all amid the tumult of the Industrial Revolution. Mid-19th century England was a furnace of innovation and progress, where great prosperity and great poverty frequently existed side by side. Sleepy medieval market towns found themselves transformed into smoggy metropolises by cotton mills and mining. Railways and telegraph lines sprang up across Britain, forging regional economies together into a national powerhouse. Rhodes' hometown of Bishop Stortford was no stranger to this brave new world. Its railway, completed 5 years before Rhodes' birth in 1848, triggered an industrial boom, with the malting industry, agriculture, coal and timber businesses spawning rank after rank of brick-built back-to-back houses. Having secured its hold over the neighbouring kingdom of Ireland in the preceding 2 centuries, the 19th century saw Great Britain build a network of mercantile colonies across the world, supplying its domestic industrial base with raw materials and its emerging middle class with luxury imports. The Opium Wars, which were fought during Rhodes' youth, saw the culmination of British aims to subdue China as a trading rival and to transform it into a lucrative junior partner. The British concession of Hong Kong, forced by the Treaty of Nanking at the end of the First Opium War, was a decade old in 1853. The British East India Company had operated in China for almost a century by the time of Rhodes' birth, and British rule in India would enter a new phase in 1858 with the foundation of direct British rule over the entire subcontinent. At the age of 9, Rhodes began attending the Bishop Stortford Grammar School. There was no state education provided to children in England before the Elementary Education Act of 1870 set up the first board schools, so the fact that Rhodes' family could afford to send him to a fee-paying establishment already places him far above most. But Rhodes was a diligent and hard-working student if not academically exceptional. However, by his early teenage years, Rhodes began showing symptoms of the recurrent respiratory problems that would dog him for the rest of his life. Asthma left the young Rhodes unable to study for long periods, and he was eventually forced to leave school, finishing his schooling at home under the tutelage of his father. Initially, it was feared that the boy might be showing early signs of tuberculosis, but Rhodes' condition did not worsen. However, it was his poor health, combined with the comparatively limited resources of the Rhodes household, that resulted in the decision not to send Cecil to a public school. This would leave Rhodes with a sense of inferiority amid his upper-crust peers later in life, whose aristocratic families had been able to afford to send them to elite institutions such as Eton or Winchester. As Rhodes' education drew to a close in his mid-teens, he was faced with choosing a career path. Military service was ruled out by his fragile health, and Mrs. Rhodes expressed concern about how well Cecil would survive the rough and tumble of public life. The most obvious choice would have been to follow his father into the Anglican Church, but the young Rhodes favoured a career in the law, to the mild disapproval of his family. Doubts remained as to Cecil's academic preparedness for enrolment at Oxford University, when in 1870 a letter arrived from one of Cecil's older brothers, Herbert. 2 years previously, Herbert had left home to begin a speculative venture cultivating cotton in the British colony of Natal on the southeastern tip of the continent of Africa. In his letter, Herbert invited the young Rhodes to join him on the African frontier. This seemed like the ideal tonic for Cecil. The family doctor assured him that the dry climate would be good for his lungs, and his father hoped that the young, slightly troubled young man would have the opportunity to find himself before his studies at Oxford. Embarking on the gap-year trip that would turn into his life's work, Rhodes left England on the small sailing bark Eudora for the 72-day trip to South Africa. He celebrated his 17th birthday during the voyage, and he disembarked in the port of Durban on the 1st of September 1870. The young Rhodes found a colony of galvanized iron buildings and dirt roads, where white European overseers marshaled teams of Zulu, Khoikhoi and San laborers in fields of sugar and cotton, watched over by British redcoats. Before the arrival of Europeans in the 17th century, the rich lands of southern Africa were inhabited by the Khoikhoi, San and Nguni. These peoples were distinguished by their occupations. The Khoikhoi were predominantly pastoralists, whilst the San were nomadic hunter-gatherers. The Nguni, of whom the Zulus were one ethnic group, had a series of wealthy kingdoms on the eastern coast. The abundant livestock kept by the Khoikhoi led to an informal trade between Portuguese and Dutch sailing vessels making their way around the Cape of Good Hope from the 15th century onward. This was formalized in 1652, when the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials VOC, founded a permanent outpost at Cape Town to act as a way station for the VOC ships travelling to Dutch possessions in East Asia. The VOC began settling the land with retiring company employees. These corporate settlers were known as farmers, or boers in Dutch. However, relations with the Khoikhoi as well as the San deteriorated quickly as a struggle for land emerged. The pastoralist Khoikhoi were viewed by the Dutch settlers as a readily available labour force. They were violently evicted from their communal lands and either forced to work on private Dutch plantations or pushed into the African interior. The San, on the other hand, were viewed merely as competition, and because their hunting traditions made no distinction between wild animals and Dutch-owned livestock, they were subject to campaigns of extermination. Although company charters officially prohibited the enslavement of the indigenous South Africans, their traditional ways of life were systematically wiped out, and the Dutch imported large numbers of enslaved people from elsewhere in their empire. The Dutch-speaking inhabitants of South Africa increasingly began to think of themselves as Afrikaners, and they began to speak a pidgin language to communicate between themselves and the Khoisan peoples called Afrikaans. It remains the third most spoken of South Africa's 11 official languages. The colony remained profitable but small up until the French Revolutionary Wars, which sent shockwaves through the Dutch world. The hammer blow fell in 1795. The Dutch Republic collapsed under French invasion, and the pro-French Batavian Republic took its place. This raised the prospect that the Cape Colony would fall into the French orbit, denying the British access to the only colonial port on the voyage between Great Britain and British India, potentially even becoming an African outpost for the French Navy. Hence, 5 ships of the line were dispatched to seize the Cape Colony in the name of King George III. The Dutch authorities and settlers put up stiff resistance, but the colony was occupied. When the Dutch Republic was liberated from French occupation in 1813, it was granted back most of its colonial possessions. However, the British government had realized South Africa's strategic and economic value in the emerging era of global geopolitics. Great Britain would retain control over South African affairs until 1931. British rule in the Cape Colony brought significant changes for the Dutch-speaking Afrikaners. Schools and churches were now mandated to teach and preach exclusively in English, and the new colonial administrators were almost all drawn from the upper and upper-middle classes of the British Isles. The resulting hostility between the inflexible British administration and the Dutch-speaking Boers resulted in a large, rapid emigration. The Afrikaner Voortrekker pioneers travelled from the coastal territory of the Cape Colony into the African interior in a mass migration known as the Great Trek. There they engaged in brutal resource wars against the Xhosa and Zulu inhabitants of the region and carved out 2 independent states known as the Boer Republics. These were the Orange Free State, centered around the Orange River, and the Transvaal Republic, beyond the River Vaal. These states existed under the nominal sovereignty of the British Empire, but in reality they were self-governing. A third Boer Republic had been proclaimed in 1839, when Boer Voortrekkers had defeated a Zulu army more than 10,000 strong and proclaimed the Republic of Natalia on the southeast coast. But the British could not countenance losing control of its principal port, and they quickly quashed the rising, incorporating it as the colony of Natal. Cecil Rhodes would arrive at this port, Durban, in September 1870, and, as we shall see, an ill-judged attempt to intervene in the affairs of the Boer republics would spell doom for Rhodes' political career in 2 decades' time. Initially, British policy toward indigenous workers was little different from the authoritarian VOC, but as the century progressed, some improvements were made. Britain outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and it abolished slavery altogether in 1833. But many freed men found themselves locked into exploitative apprenticeships, which were periodically renewed. Some limited civil rights were extended to the Khoikhoi, but the genocidal extermination of the San continued throughout the period, particularly in Boer regions. Unlike the rigid caste system employed by the VOC, British law was steadfastly colorblind. Laws applied equally to all groups under British rule, although racially charged unequal administration of the law was still common. A homogeneous class of mixed-race day-wage labourers began to emerge, whose heritage was of the Khoisan peoples, imported enslaved people, and European settlers. These were known as the Cape Coloureds, and they made up the vast majority of the workers that Cecil Rhodes would employ in his business ventures. Having disembarked from the Eudora in Durban in September 1870, Rhodes made his way inland to the Umkomaas Valley in central Natal colony. There his brother Herbert had planted 20 acres of cotton. The American Civil War, beginning in 1861, had interrupted global cotton supplies and made cotton cultivation elsewhere in the world far more economically viable. Herbert had arrived late to this prospect, only beginning his venture in 1868, but American cotton harvests remained poor, and so there was money to be made. The environs of inland Natal apparently suited Rhodes' constitution, but the brothers' business venture was less than successful. Herbert was a poor farmer, failing to plant his crops properly, and, like all of the colony's settler farmers, he failed to utilize the agricultural expertise of the local Xhosa. Nevertheless, this was Rhodes' first experience of business. He wrote home to his mother of his optimism and the belief that cotton would prove to be the staple of the colony. Rhodes was unusual amongst his peers in his attitude toward his African employees. Where most colonists considered the indigenous Africans to be little more than children who were incapable of rational thought, Rhodes wrote of them with a degree of respect. Rather than laziness, Rhodes saw independence, and he documented his managerial attempts to provide them with different incentives and disincentives. He believed in the honesty of his workers and would lend small sums of money to them with little or no interest, saying that they were safer than the Bank of England. But there can be little doubt that Rhodes' racial attitudes were formed by a predominantly white society in which he was the sole beneficiary of his interactions with the natives. He revels in having many black attendants, and his writings are scattered with slurs. Yet, from the beginning, he displayed an unusual brand of capitalistic egalitarianism, where his ceaseless drive to make money overrode some of the more absurd axioms of contemporary racial thought. Soon after beginning work on his brother's cotton plantation, the Rhodes brothers dined with Captain Loftus Rolleston, a gentleman diamond prospector. Herbert had accompanied Captain Rolleston on his last expedition and had even found a few small stones himself, but they were nothing compared to the large glittering stones which the captain showed them. Cecil was enthralled. He wrote that it made his mouth water. The first diamonds had been discovered in South Africa 3 years previously, when in 1867 a 22-carat stone was discovered on the De Kalk farm on the Orange River. The diamond trade remained small, with little formal prospecting, diamonds mostly being traded to Europeans by mixed-race Griqua farmers. But in 1869, a large diamond weighing 83 carats was purchased from a Griqua for the price of 500 sheep, 10 oxen and a horse. The stone later sold in Britain for £25,000. By the time Cecil Rhodes arrived in Natal, prospectors were beginning to flood into unincorporated land in search of more deposits. South Africa's diamond rush had begun. Having already lost his interest in farming, Herbert left his cotton fields in May of 1871 to pursue diamond prospecting full-time. The more conscientious Cecil remained in Natal until the autumn, seeing the cotton harvest diligently through to completion. But the siren call of the stones, shown to him by Captain Rolleston, had gripped him utterly, and in September of 1871, after a year managing his brother's cotton plantation, Rhodes made the 400-mile trip across the Drakensberg mountain range to join his brother in the diamond fields. Rhodes' destination was the Colesberg Kopje, a small hill about 30 feet high and 200 feet wide, located about 70 miles east of the confluence of the Orange and Vaal rivers. The rock that made up the Kopje was formed over 100 miles deep within the Earth's mantle under immense pressures, a veritable crucible of diamond formation. The diamond-rich slurry was then forced rapidly and explosively to the surface in a volcanic eruption, cooling to leave a vertical carrot-shaped pipe. The upper part of the pipe, where it had been most exposed to weathering, was soft and crumbly, and was known as yellow ground, and it could be easily excavated by hand. Within the single pipe beneath the Colesberg Kopje was the mineral wealth that would make the fortunes of an entire colony. The Kopje at Colesberg had only been discovered 2 months earlier, when Rhodes was still bringing in the cotton harvest in Natal. It had been found by a group of Dutch prospectors on the land belonging to the Vooruitzicht farm, which was owned by a pair of brothers named De Beers. News of the diamond strike spread quickly, and the site was divided into 500 tiny claims, each only 31 feet square. The resulting mine was christened New Rush. By Rhodes' arrival in October, over 5,000 prospectors and labourers had descended upon New Rush, living in a vast squalid tent encampment that sprawled over the farmland. The physical process of diamond mining was simple but brutally hard work. The yellow ground had to be smashed up with picks so that it could be coarsely sieved in large wire frames, and the resulting large pieces removed by buckets to be further sieved and scraped. Diamonds were discovered at every stage of this process, straight out of the ground, in the coarse sieves, and on the scraping tables. The overwhelming majority of the manual work was done by landless black labourers, the descendants of the Khoisan, who had been stripped of their ancestral lands under Dutch rule. The prospectors were mostly white. English, Dutch, Swedish, Russian, American and Turkish were the chief nationalities, but there were a few Griqua and Khoisan entrepreneurs in the early period. The raw diamonds would mostly be sold to the more established diamond traders by the prospectors, but many were covertly bought directly from labourers by unlicensed chancers. In total, New Rush was producing £50,000 worth of diamonds every single week, more than $5 million in today's money. By the time that the New Rush mine was exhausted and shut down in 1914, it would become the largest hand-dug hole in the world, almost 800 feet deep, having yielded more than 13 million carats of diamonds. The New Rush mine was in what was known as Griqua land, unincorporated territory between the Cape Colony and the Boer republics. The Orange Free State was first to recognize the magnitude of the discovery at the Vooruitzicht farm. It instituted a simple taxation system with informal regulation. No individual or consortium could own more than 2 claims, and every claim had to be worked every day. The 19-year-old Cecil Rhodes immediately began wondering what would be possible if this restriction were removed. By 1873, the British had sent a delegate to the Vooruitzicht farm, and they incorporated the ramshackle settlement as the town of Kimberley, named for the British colonial secretary, the Earl of Kimberley. After much wrangling, the Orange Free State was partially compensated for their loss, but this set the tone for the resource conflicts to come. It cannot be overstated the degree to which New Rush was the embryo of the future of South Africa. Its wealth positioned the diamond magnates to be the rulers of the colony in less than a decade. Since living conditions were so squalid, the prospectors frequently slept many men to a tent, and so Rhodes would bunk up with future members of the Cape Colony Parliament, future cabinet members, and future prime ministers. One future prime minister was John Xavier Merriman, also the son of a rural English curate with whom Rhodes tented in 1872. In his first few weeks at New Rush, Rhodes made around £100 per week, but the limits on claim ownership heavily restricted his income. Rhodes sought partnerships to increase the efficiency of his digging, and his firmest and longest-standing partner was Charles Rudd. Rudd was 9 years Rhodes' elder, having been born to a London shipbuilder in 1844. Like Rhodes, Rudd had come to the Cape Colony for health reasons, cutting short his university studies. There he established a merchant network, moving goods to and from the inland Trekboers. Where Rhodes appears to have had the more free-wheeling imagination and speculative drive, Rudd was solid, dependable, and parsimonious. The combination of the two men would be the cornerstone of Rhodes' financial empire. Having established the footings of a business empire, Rhodes returned to England in August 1873, leaving his joint operations in the hands of the capable Charles Rudd. Rhodes initially returned home on receiving word that his mother was seriously ill, but upon finding her some way from death's door, Rhodes turned his attention back to his lifelong ambition: study at Oxford University. Rhodes was admitted to Oriel College as a late entrant in October. His career there was fragmentary. At the end of 1873, his mother passed away. Ailing physically and stricken with grief, Rhodes returned to the diamond fields to throw himself into work after only 1 term of study. He would complete his degree with terms taken piecemeal throughout the 1870s. His academic studies would advance him considerably, but the social doors which an Oxford degree would unlock were worth immeasurably more to him. Oxford shaped Rhodes' world view. heartening his deep admiration for the British Empire and admitting him into the social ranks of the aristocracy. The advantage of a public school education would benefit all of his business and political dealings from then on. Rhodes would say later, "Wherever you turn your eye, except in science, an Oxford man is at the top of the tree," and in time he would become such a man. Whilst at Oxford, Rhodes was inducted into the Freemasons, a group which he found surprisingly disillusioning. Whilst he coveted the network of mutual aid amongst the elite that it represented, from within he found it stuffy. In 1877 he wrote, "I see the wealth and power they possess, the influence they hold, and I think over their ceremonies, and I wonder that a large body of men can devote themselves to what at times appear the most ridiculous and absurd rites, without an object and without an end." Doubtless this would inform his lifelong desire to found his own secret society. During his spells back at New Rush, in between his terms at Oxford, Rhodes was one of the first to recognize the precariousness of the diamond trade. With hundreds of prospectors each with only one or two claims, uncontrolled production risked flooding the market. Rhodes' approach was twofold. Firstly, diversifying his burgeoning wealth, and in the long term, seeking to monopolize the diamond fields in order to restrict production and maintain high prices through artificial scarcity. In pursuit of the first goal, Rhodes began investing in infrastructure, such as the Cape Colonies project to build a railway to Durban. He and Charles Rudd also purchased a steam-powered ice-making machine from England, which they assembled at New Rush, keeping miners supplied with cool drinks and ice cream. After a successful summer, they sold it for £1,500, their first large windfall. As Rhodes had predicted, within a few years of free-for-all diamond mining, prices began to slump. Not only had the market been flooded, but also the soft yellow ground had been mostly exhausted, giving way to harder blue ground, which had to be broken with machinery or dynamite. With rising capital costs and falling prices, many miners began to leave the workings, and thus the restrictions on claim ownership were relaxed, firstly to 10 claims per individual, and then later they were abolished altogether. This was the opportunity Rhodes and Rudd had been waiting for. They aggressively ploughed their capital into more and more claims, betting that they could outpace the market with efficiencies of scale. However, Rhodes and Rudd would have foundered upon the rocks of financial ruin were it not for their ability to leverage debt. Instrumental in opening lines of credit for the New Rush miners was a German of Jewish heritage named Alfred Beit. Beit had arrived at Kimberley in 1875, sent by an Amsterdam diamond trader. He took to South Africa like a duck to water. Through his contacts in the German and Dutch banking industries, Beit was the financial powerhouse behind the rise of the Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company, owned by the flamboyant prospector Barney Barnato. Barnato was born Barnett Isaacs in Aldgate, London. Barnato's family were desperately poor, and he scraped a living prize-fighting, performing in music halls and begging. When Barnato joined his brother at the Kimberley mines, treading the same path as Rhodes, he quickly conceived of the same goal: consolidation of all the mining claims in order to control supply and maintain prices. In the late 1870s, Barnato and Rhodes would become locked in a titanic struggle for control of the Kimberley mines. Beit and his banking consortium behind Barnato and the French Rothschild bankers behind Rhodes. The deadlock was broken when Beit switched sides to Rhodes' camp, with Barnato agreeing to merge with Rhodes Holdings. Upon the merger of the two companies in 1880, Rhodes, Rudd and Beit formed a consolidated company that held an unassailable position in the South African diamond trade. They named it after the owners of the Vooruitzicht farm, De Beers Mining Limited. Its rise from behemoth to monopoly was rapid. By 1887, only 7 years after its foundation, De Beers realized Rhodes' dream by acquiring all diamond mines in South Africa. Fully cartelized, Rhodes could now artificially restrict diamond production, maintaining high prices in perpetuity, a monopoly which De Beers retained for more than a century. As Rhodes expanded his business holdings from a handful of mining claims into a powerful industrial combine, his sense of what was possible began to expand too. His biographers often point to a document known as the Confession of Faith that he wrote in 1877 as a seed change in the scale of Rhodes' ambition. In it, he lays out the foundational plan for a secret society, which would extend Anglo-Saxon cultural supremacy over the entire world through a network of closely controlled colonies. The idea for which Rhodes is most remembered, the idea of a British imperial domain that would stretch from Cape to Cairo, is expressed clearly in this document for the first time. He writes, "Africa is still lying ready for us. It is our duty to take it. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." It is this vision that he would spend the rest of his life attempting to implement. Doubtless, this was partly the expression of a giddy youth, flush with riches from his diamond mining. He was only 24 years of age when he wrote it, but at the same time, it indicates a serious attempt to engage with the practicalities of imperial rule. Therefore, it is only natural that Rhodes should have turned his attention next to the world of colonial politics. The Cape Colony had one responsible government in 1872, whilst Rhodes was still establishing himself as a small-scale diamond prospector. Rather than a Crown-appointed military governor, most of the civil administration of the colony was now undertaken by a parliament based in Cape Town, which elected a prime minister and a cabinet. Elections to the House were democratic, but their most interesting feature is that they were formally colourblind. The Cape Colony's 1852 constitution formally recognized that black and mixed-race residents of the Cape were fellow subjects with white men. Electoral eligibility was based on a property qualification of £25 annually, known as the £25 vote. As with many electoral systems in the 19th century, the franchise excluded all women, but the property qualification was unusually low, and it applied to black and white equally. It even recognized the traditional forms of African land ownership as valid for the purposes of the franchise. Whilst in practice the Cape Colony's franchise barred more Africans from voting than it did whites, it is far more inclusive than almost any other colonial electoral system in the world, and political participation of black Africans grew steadily throughout the 1870s. The political culture of the Cape Colony was markedly liberal compared to the Boer states, where black political participation had always been outlawed. The 1870s were a time of unsuccessful expansionism by the British administration. The British Colonial Secretary, Lord Carnarvon, determined to impose a confederation on the various Boer and indigenous states, seeking to bring them all under direct imperial control, and sideline the liberal Cape Colony Parliament. To this end, the British High Commission conducted numerous expeditions against both the Boers to the north of the colony and the Nguni peoples in the east. These included a full-scale invasion of neighbouring Kaelkeland, but the campaign was badly bungled by Prime Minister Sir Gordon Sprigg, who insisted on disarming the Cape Colony's many black soldiers. Shortly afterward, the British launched an invasion of Zulu territory, following a devastating defeat at Isandlwana. At the hands of the Zulu host, the British conducted the famous defence of Rorke's Drift, winning a Pyrrhic victory. British attempts to impose suzerainty on the Transvaal Republic resulted in the First Boer War, during which British colonial authorities were comprehensively expelled from their occupation. In all, Carnarvon's plans for confederation became bogged down in expensive victories and crushing defeats. During the attempts to impose confederation, the Cape Colony formally annexed Griqualand West, the region containing New Rush and Kimberley, and in 1880, the Cape Town Parliament voted to create 4 new constituencies to represent its residents. It was one of these, Berkeley West, that Rhodes set his sights upon. It would return him at every election until the end of his life. He was encouraged in this endeavour by his riding companion John X. Merryman, himself already a former cabinet minister and by now a determined anti-imperialist, having led the opposition to the governor's failed Confederation scheme. Another supporter of Rhodes' political ambitions was Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, a Scottish contemporary of Rhodes who had set up a medical practice in Kimberley in 1878. The exact nature of Jameson and Rhodes' relationship is uncertain, but he is usually described as Rhodes' intimate friend, although many speculate that the two men may have been lovers. Jameson's medical work brought him into contact with a wide variety of the region's political figures, and he counted both Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal Republic, and King Lobengula of the Ndebele people among his patients. As with all of Rhodes' close personal relationships, business and pleasure heavily overlapped. Rhodes was comfortably elected in Berkeley West in 1881, and he entered the Cape Colony Parliament at the age of 28. He cut a highly unorthodox figure in the House, wearing his Oxford tweeds into the chamber instead of formal dress, and he frequently forgot or ignored parliamentary decorum by referring to the members directly by their names rather than their constituencies. The Parliament was recovering from a period of intense political crisis. Lord Carnarvon's failed Confederation scheme left the reputation of the body in tatters. Boer militiamen had resoundingly defeated a redcoat column of equal number at Majuba Hill only 6 weeks earlier. But economically, the Cape Colony was booming. The infrastructural projects that Rhodes and other industrialists had bankrolled, including roads, railways and telegraph lines, had transformed South Africa into an extractive powerhouse. Kimberley was the second town in the world to install electric street lighting, with Cape Town following soon after. The question facing the legislature was how best to position themselves amid the states of the region and the emerging scramble for Africa by the great powers of Europe. Whilst Rhodes agreed with the ambition of Carnarvon's plans, he took issue with its inept execution. One of his first acts was to join with the anti-imperialist Dutch supremacist Afrikaner Bond under Jan Hofmeyr to lever Prime Minister Sprigg out of office. A rebellion in the British protectorate of Basutoland, known as the Gun War, had broken out over Sprigg's enforced disarmament policies, and it led to his resignation in 1881. Rhodes' maiden speech in Parliament was a broadside against Sprigg's leadership. It is interesting to note that Rhodes' allegiances were wholly flexible. In allying with the anti-imperialist cause, he could advance his own career, and thereby the cause of imperialism as a whole. Other legislation supported by Rhodes was a more routine matter of self-interest. The Diamond Trade Act, for example, imposed de facto martial law in Kimberley, with colonial police empowered to conduct indiscriminate raids at any time in pursuit of stolen diamonds. Rhodes argued unsuccessfully that the act should contain a provision allowing for thieves to be publicly flogged. Whilst the Parliament dealt with the fallout from the Basuto Gun War, Rhodes was already planning his next steps in the interior. He raised the alarm over the foundation of two new independent Boer states, Stellaland and Goshen, along the northward road into the African interior, which would, he predicted, naturally fall into the orbit of the Transvaal Republic and threaten British expansion. But these states were much more complex than he had assumed. They were formed by a local indigenous leader, granting territory to a collection of Boer mercenaries. Both Jan Hofmeyr and John Merryman judged that a raid into this territory risked both destabilizing the indigenous politics of the region and angering the Transvaal Republic. Here, Rhodes began to part company with the two leaders. They were both anti-imperialist, though Hofmeyr was a convinced Dutch supremacist and Merryman a liberal. Rhodes was most avowedly imperialist, and he expressed it in a famous phrase in the Cape Town Parliament when he stated boldly that the government should seek to annex land, not natives. Rhodes' project was one of Lebensraum before the concept would reach wide currency in the 20th century, to clear land of its unproductive, uncivilized inhabitants for colonization by, in his words, Anglo-Saxons. Rhodes' desire to strike northward came from a deep-seated conviction that the subjugation of African peoples was inevitable. The question was merely whether it would be the British or the Boers who would do so. But fortunately, a diplomatic solution was achieved. The London Convention of 1884 rewrote the relationship with the Transvaal Republic, keeping Stellaland and Goshen firmly outside of Transvaal influence, securing the road northward for the British, in return for scrapping imperial suzerainty over the Republic. The London Convention also empowered the British to establish a protectorate over what was referred to as Bechuanaland. This huge territory was drawn north of Griqualand West, with arbitrary straight borders that paid no respect to internal political divisions. As this protectorate was being established, the industrious Rhodes was invited to his first cabinet position, that of Treasurer General, and he set to expanding his business empire into the new protectorate with gusto. With significant new investments in Basutoland and Bechuanaland at the periphery of British territory, Rhodes spent much of the latter half of the 1880s extending his diamond concerns to monopolize the entirety of the South African diamond trade. But Rhodes no longer viewed this as an end in itself. Rhodes ensured that the corporate structure of De Beers allowed its profits to be used for a whole range of activities, such as equipping private troops, building infrastructural projects such as railways and water infrastructure, and governing land. Rhodes was planning to use De Beers as an engine for imperialist expansion. Gold was discovered in Witwatersrand in the Transvaal Republic in 1886, and Rhodes was quick to capitalize on the discovery. The gold rush in the Transvaal was very different to the diamond rush that had made Rhodes' own fortune. The gold was hundreds of feet underground and required large capital investments and expertise to mine it. Thus, only a handful of capitalists as wealthy as Rhodes could afford to exploit the opportunity. The corporate gold rush led to a class of outlanders, predominantly British foreigners, flooding into the territory for the gold rush. Their presence in the Republic, without citizenship and barely tolerated by the Transvaal authorities, would become a major flashpoint in the near future. In this venture, Rhodes and his fellow mining entrepreneurs acquired a new epithet, the Randlords, after the gold mines at Witwatersrand. It would also become the name of the Union of South Africa's future currency. It is easy to portray Rhodes as a megalomaniacal genius with an overarching plan that he rigidly executed, step by step, but the reality is that Rhodes was far more reactive, taking advantage of opportunities which presented themselves, fitting them into his Cape to Cairo schema as he went. Since the establishment of the British protectorate over Bechuanaland, Rhodes had been very aware of the friendliness between the Transvaal Republic and the Northern Ndebele people, also known as the Matabele. The Northern Ndebele were closely related to the Zulu people and had been forced out of the Transvaal by the Dutch Trekboers in the 1830s. They had invaded the land north of the Limpopo River and formed a powerful and sophisticated kingdom. In 1870, King Lobengula had ascended to the throne, and he had smartly exploited tensions between the Transvaal and the British Cape Colony to secure himself. Finally, in 1888, Lobengula signed a treaty with the British, agreeing to conduct diplomatic relations only with the Cape Colony. This was the opportunity Rhodes had been waiting for. If he could secure exclusive mining rights from Lobengula, he could appeal to the British Colonial Office for a royal charter. This was the same mechanism by which the East India Company had justified its colonial project of land seizures on the Indian subcontinent. And he could use De Beers, with its permissive trust structure, to arm and supply a British South Africa company. Aware that Boer and British prospectors and land seekers were already flocking to Lobengula's capital at Bulawayo, Rhodes sent his right-hand man Charles Rudd in person to negotiate with the king. Racing cross-country, Rudd and the De Beers delegation arrived ahead of any major competitors, and the offer they made to King Lobengula could be matched by no other. King Lobengula signed a document that granted the De Beers consortium exclusive mining rights to all of the gold between the Zambezi and the Limpopo rivers, in return for 1,000 breech-loading rifles, a steamboat on the Zambezi River, and a stipend of £100 monthly. But almost immediately, the document came under scrutiny. The terms of the concession were written in obscure legal English, using concepts of property and land ownership that were entirely alien to the Ndebele, and Lobengula had no impartial interpreter or legal advice beyond the Ndebele speakers brought along by the De Beers delegation. As well as this, the concession seemed to imply that the British could acquire land and wealth far beyond mere mining claims, including logging, water rights, and much more. Lobengula sent letters of protestation officially suspending the terms of the agreement, pending a more thorough investigation of its meaning. These letters were delivered to Britain personally by two of Lobengula's head men, but the British government's reply was only one of vague reassurance. Meanwhile, Rhodes seized upon Rudd's news with both hands. Travelling to London in March 1889, Rhodes just overlapped with the returning Ndebele delegation. Amid protests from humanitarian organisations and concerned British administrators, Rhodes lobbied for a royal charter to exploit the far-reaching Rudd concession. Like Rhodes, the British government was focused only on beating other regional powers, and so Rhodes' British South Africa Company was granted a royal charter in August 1889. Its wording was extremely vague. It set no northern or western boundary on the company, giving Rhodes near limitless authority to exploit the land north of Bechuanaland and west of Portuguese Mozambique, from a limited concession to exploit mineral wealth acquired with questionable legality. Rhodes seized his own personal empire. Returning to the Cape Colony, Rhodes received a rapturous welcome from the Cape's Afrikaner population. When Sir Gordon Spriggs' second ministry founded in mid-1890, Rhodes was perfectly positioned to assume the premiership. A muscular advocate for the extension of the colony's control over the interior, Rhodes had based his power on an ideological justification of minority rule. He appealed to both the Cape Dutch with his patronage of Hofmeier's Afrikaner Bond and to the British colonists and business interests with his steadfast pro-empire stance. He was made Prime Minister in July 1890 at the age of just 37. By the time Rhodes became Prime Minister, his preparations for a private invasion of Mashonaland were already well underway. If there was any doubt as to whether the Rudd concession was merely a pretext to acquire the official gloss for an invasion of Lobengula's territory, it is belied by the outfitting of this invasion force. The British South Africa Company equipped 250 colonial policemen with Martini Henry rifles, Maxim guns, and a powerful electric searchlight, as well as brand new British South Africa Company uniforms. The colonial police accompanied a column of 62 wagons and civilian colonists deep into Mashonaland, founding 3 settlements at Lowveld, Fort Victoria, and Fort Charter, now Harare, Zimbabwe. In time, these colonists would follow the path trod by the Dutch in the early years of the Cape Colony, forcibly dispossessing indigenous people, forcing many into exploitative wage labor in the mines and on farms, and massacring those who were deemed unfit. Administration of Mashonaland was given to Rhodes' close personal friend, Dr. Leander Jameson. Jameson sought to avoid confrontation with Lobengula, his old patient, and Lobengula, for his part, sought to restrain the impulse of his vassals to confront the invasion. But with more and more white colonists flocking to the region, confrontation became inevitable. In 1893, hostilities broke out into the open. Though Lobengula's troops were highly trained warriors, the British Maxim machine gun had forever changed the calculus of colonial warfare. The First Matabele War resulted in more than 10,000 Ndebele dead, with the British South Africa Company losing only 100 men. Lobengula died of sickness during the war, and his kingdom disintegrated. The regions of Mashonaland and Matabeleland would bear a new name, Rhodesia, officially named in 1897. As Prime Minister, Rhodes took the first serious steps towards undermining the Cape Colony's colourblind franchise. As we saw earlier, the Cape Colony's electoral system was unusually egalitarian for a 19th century colony, with the £25 vote and a growing black electorate. Attempts to restrict the franchise had been unsuccessful until the mid-1880s, when white anxiety about black electoral participation began to tip the balance. Rhodes' premiership would introduce two pieces of landmark legislation aimed squarely at turning the vote into an exclusive right of white South Africans. The first of these was the 1892 Franchise and Ballot Act, which raised the property qualification from £25 to £75. Although this legislation was not directly racial, its intent was clear. The parliamentary recess of 1891 to 92 was dominated by explicit discussions of restricting the black vote, and Rhodes openly courted the Afrikaner Bond's proposals, whose members now publicly referred to black Cape citizens with exterminationist language. Rhodes' solution of an increase in the property qualification was a neat one. It neither violated the colour-blind language of the 1852 Constitution, nor was it objectionable enough to alienate all of the Parliament's progressives. The second franchise-restricting policy was the Glen Grey Act. Although initially applied only to the small mountainous county of Glen Grey, it outlined an African policy which would prove the model for the future South Africa. It effectively abolished communal ownership altogether in the region, dispossessing a large number of Xhosa and instituting a labour tax to force them into white-owned businesses. Although in practice this added many land-owning African families to the voter rolls, it struck directly at the foundation of black participation in politics: communal land ownership. The approach that Rhodes took to legislation during the Glen Grey Act is a demonstration of his ethos. He introduced the bill at the very end of the 1894 parliamentary session and barraged the House with an hour and 40-minute long speech containing a huge amount of detail, much of it only finalized hours before its final drafting. Onlookers were alternately impressed and alienated. What appears to be a masterful step forward in Rhodes' overarching plan, when examined closely, appears to be ad hoc and invented on the fly. Rhodes, it seemed, was secure and popular amongst his supporters, and was also building a power base that excluded his opponents amongst progressive and non-white South Africans. But his ambitions would come to a crashing halt over the issue of the Transvaal and the disastrous Jameson raid. As we have seen throughout Rhodes' life, the Transvaal Republic had always been a determined opponent of British interests in the region. Indeed, its foundation by consciously anti-British voortrekkers fundamentally shaped its political constitution. We have seen the Transvaal actively oppose the Cape Colony, first over Confederation, then over the road into the interior, as well as over indigenous policy. But the gold strike of 1886 put the two states into a fatal collision course. The large community of gold mining outlanders posed a serious political problem for the Transvaal government. The 60,000-strong expatriate community outnumbered the 30,000 Boers by 2 to 1. Extending the franchise would mean political oblivion, and so the Transvaal president, Paul Kruger, denied citizenship to the outlanders and heavily taxed their mining operations, particularly the sale of dynamite. Denied political representation and taxed to the hilt, leaders amongst the outlander community began covertly planning a coup against Pretoria, the Transvaal's capital, in 1895. One such leader was Colonel Frank Rhodes, one of Cecil's older brothers. Getting wind of these rumblings of discontent, Rhodes, now 43 years old, saw it as the perfect opportunity to stamp British authority onto the Transvaal once and for all. He set his close ally Jameson onto planning an invasion in support of the Outlander uprising, with the aim of seizing the Johannesburg goldfields for the Cape. Jameson assembled 400 British South Africa Company police at the border, along with Maxim guns, artillery, and several hundred volunteers. However, at the last minute, political differences arose within the coup plotters' camp, and the Outlander uprising was delayed. Jameson, exercising the faulty judgment of a surgeon acting upon inadequate information, elected to invade anyway, hoping to force the Outlanders' hand. British colonial authorities had been supportive of intervention into Transvaal, but when they discovered Rhodes and Jameson's intent to invade without an Outlander coup, they were deeply concerned. They sent telegrams ordering Jameson to abort, but Jameson's men had already cut the telegraph wires south. However, mistakes quickly began to mount. Jameson failed to cut the northbound telegraph wires to the Transvaal capital at Pretoria. The invasion column was quickly bogged down by Boer roadblocks, who alerted the capital immediately. A large Boer force, armed with field guns, hurried down to Doornkop, where Jameson and his colonial police were surrounded. Jameson surrendered in the early hours of the morning of the 2nd of January 1896. The leaders of the Johannesburg Outlanders, including Colonel Frank Rhodes, were imprisoned and quickly sentenced to death. A combination of poor preparation, inadequate intelligence work, and blustering ego from its planners had doomed the raid from the start. News of Jameson's failed raid detonated like an exploding bomb in Cape Town. As the conspiracy unraveled, Rhodes' position as ringleader was entirely untenable, and he resigned the premiership just 10 days after Jameson's surrender. The British prevailed upon the Transvaal to commute the death sentences of Rhodes' brother and the other Outlanders, who were handed over to British authorities in exchange for a ransom of £400,000. They were later prosecuted in Britain. Each received 15 months' imprisonment. These light sentences were informed by the outpouring of British public jingoism against the Boers, further inflamed by a brazen telegram of congratulations sent from the German Kaiser Wilhelm II to President Paul Kruger. Rhodes' biographer Robert Rotberg wonders why a man of crowned glory involved himself so unnecessarily in an exercise as destructive and treacherous as the Jameson raid. Rhodes' dream of uniting all of the white races of South Africa went up in smoke. He had burned whatever possibility there was of a peaceful incorporation of the Transvaal into a South African Union. The Jameson raid was one of the major causes of the Second Boer War, which broke out after the failure of negotiations in 1899. Both Rhodes and Alfred Beit were compelled to resign from the board of the British South Africa Company. It was stripped of its monopoly in Matabeleland, and it was indemnified by the Transvaal for the sum of £1 million. As well, Rhodes was the subject of a personal injury lawsuit by one of Jameson's volunteers, who contended that Rhodes had lied in order to gain men for the adventure. Rhodes lost and was forced to pay £3,000 of his own money in damages. However, Rhodes came through the political fallout remarkably unscathed. The House of Commons' official inquiry into the Jameson raid was a whitewash. Although it held Rhodes personally responsible, it made no recommendations of punishment, and it also glossed over the role of the British South Africa Company and the British Colonial Office. The Westminster Gazette published a memorable cartoon of the Parliamentary Committee members wearing blindfolds, seated upon a prostrate figure of Rhodes, with the legend, "Well, if we can't safely do anything else, we can all sit on Rhodes. That won't hurt anyone." Much could be forgiven against the backdrop of escalating tensions with the Afrikaners in the Transvaal and the Ndebele in Rhodesia. By the end of 1896, Rhodes had recovered much of his political cachet. He would never return to frontline politics, having permanently lost the goodwill of the Afrikaners, but he never lost his seat at the Cape Parliament, and he would even quietly rejoin the board of the British South Africa Company in 1899. The expansion of company territory northwards from the Cape had made it a possibility for the British Empire to potentially control a corridor of land stretching all the way from the Mediterranean coast in Egypt down the Nile through Central Africa and into the Cape Colonies. Rhodes' aforementioned dream of a Cape to Cairo railway. Railways were a vital aspect of British rule across its larger territories, as until the advent of automobiles and aircraft, it was the only way to transport large numbers of troops, fuel and commodities across land quickly, as well as being the best way of transporting resources to the coast to be sent overseas. Therefore, the Cairo to Cape Railway was not simply a single project or line, but the gradual linking up of different railway networks in different colonies over time. Indeed, the railway is seen by some as one of Rhodes' evil machinations to extend his power over Africa, but in truth, the attempted realization of the Cairo to Cape Railway was a gradual organic process, which became more likely over time as British rule was extended down through the spine of Africa from the mid to late 1800s to the 1920s. Although Cecil Rhodes is largely remembered for his dream of building such a pan-continental railway, like so many of his plans, it was not his brainchild, as various British newspaper editors, politicians and colonial officials had proposed such an undertaking for some time. However, with the gradual British expansion northwards from the Cape and southwards from Egypt through Sudan, it was now within reach. The only problem being other powers such as France were planning their own east-west railway line, connecting its possessions across the continent, and in 1885, German East Africa, which encompassed much of present-day Rwanda, Burundi and Tanzania, was established, which was now the main obstacle in the realization of the British Railway. Thus, it would not be until long after Rhodes' death, with the defeat of Germany in World War I and the seizure of its colonial possessions, that a continuous stretch of territory from northern to southern Africa was finally realized. However, ironically, it would be both world wars and the colossal expense in manpower and riches that were needed to fight both conflicts that would eventually bankrupt and bring down the British Empire. Thus, with Britain greatly weakened after World War I, and further undermined by the Great Depression and World War II, the Cape Railway would never be fully realized, sections of which are still in use today. It stands as a fully functional relic of Britain's imperial dreams. At the end of 1894, Rhodes and the British South Africa Company held concessions over territories stretching between the Limpopo River and Lake Tanganyika, originally known as Zambezia, after the Zambezi River, which flowed through the middle of it. In May 1895, the name of the region was officially changed by the British South Africa Company to Rhodesia in honor of Rhodes, following the use of the term by local settlers from 1891, for whom Rhodes was a popular figure. Southern Rhodesia, originally Matabeleland and Mashonaland, later became Zimbabwe, and Northern Rhodesia was renamed Zambia. Rhodes built a sprawling home in Bulawayo, one of the first permanent buildings built in Rhodesia, and which is now used as the Bulawayo residence for the President of Zimbabwe. Each territory within Rhodesia was administered separately, but with a legislative council in Southern Rhodesia from 1898, made up of company-nominated representatives as well as elected members. The transition to self-government happened gradually with the increase in the number of white settlers in the region and the increase in the number of elected officials to the Legislative Council, and the formal change to a self-governing colony of Britain happened in October 1923 for Southern Rhodesia, while Northern Rhodesia became a British protectorate on the 1st of April 1924, with Sir Herbert Stanley appointed as the first governor, ending the jurisdiction of the British South Africa Company in Rhodesia. Although only in his mid-40s, Rhodes had a sense of his deteriorating health. His premiership had been exhausting, and he spent long periods in the late 1890s travelling the world, visiting Cairo, Constantinople, Rome and Zanzibar. But he certainly never relaxed. Even from afar, Rhodes was constantly telegraphing his numerous concurrent ventures: the diamond mines in West Griqualand, the gold mines of Johannesburg, the fruit farms on the Cape, and the administration in both North and South Rhodesia. Perhaps the last great moment of Rhodes' career came during the siege of Kimberley during the Second Boer War. The city had always been vulnerable to attack from the Orange Free State, but instead of abandoning it to its fate, Rhodes instead moved into the city, despite the protestations of its mayor. Rhodes' motivation was likely twofold: firstly, to keep the diamond mines producing, and secondly, to force the British to divert military resources in defense of his property. Rhodes would end up trapped in the city under bombardment by the Boers for 124 days. In typical Rhodes fashion, he clashed frequently with the commander of the city's garrison, repeatedly publishing military secrets in his newspaper. But Rhodes was doubtless instrumental to the defense of the town. He organized earthworks, water supplies, and even the production of a rifled field gun nicknamed Long Cecil. After the town was relieved by a cavalry division, Kimberley became the site of one of the largest concentration camps of the Second Boer War, interning Boer civilians and black refugees. By early 1902, Rhodes' health was failing badly. His lungs were barely working at all, in the words of his longtime physician Dr. Jameson, and his regular doses of blasting gelatin were helping little. Rhodes retired to a pleasant cottage south of Muizenberg, overlooking False Bay, where he had ridden with John Merriman many years before. He planned to recuperate for his final voyage back to the land of his birth, but he would never recover enough to make the journey. 2 months before the Boer surrender at Melrose House in May, Rhodes passed away at 6 p.m. on the 26th of March, 1902. His autopsy confirmed his doctor's fears. An expanding aneurysm in his chest cavity had compressed his lungs and eventually caused the failure of his heart. Rhodes' persistent respiratory problems, exacerbated by rich food, endless tobacco, and strong alcohol, ended his life at the age of only 48. His funeral, on which no expense was spared, was akin to that of a king, with his body being carried through the streets of Cape Town before slowly being taken by train to Rhodesia until his remains were interred on a rise named World's View, where his grave remains to this day. There have been numerous attempts by Zimbabwean politicians to exhume his body and return it to Britain. However, his final resting place is still seen by some as being an important reminder of the country's, as well as Africa's, colonial past, which cannot be erased and should be remembered, warts and all. Rhodes left behind him a financial legacy that was large, but not enormous. Whilst his mining ventures had proved highly lucrative, Rhodesia had been an expensive misadventure, as had his infrastructural investments. In total, his estate was worth around £5 million. He had no heirs and no children. The trustees of his estate followed his wishes and gave the majority of his wealth to his beloved Oxford University to fund scholarships for the development of the Anglo-Saxon race. This uncomfortable legacy still divides public opinion. A public campaign has grown to demand the end of Rhodes scholarships and the divestment of Oriel College from their ongoing association with the man. Oriel College agreed in 2021 that the statue of Rhodes on the frontage of the college building was no longer appropriate, but the statue remains in place due to concerns about the cost of its removal. A large bronze statue of Cecil Rhodes was erected in 1934 outside